Hello everyone. In this video you can get some knowledge about the history of iPhone. First ever iPhone was released on January 9, 2007 in an event in Macworld. This iPhone started a new era of smartphone world. Initially Apple released iPhone with two storage models, 4GB and 8GB, but later they stopped producing 4GB model and started 16GB model. It had a 3.5-inch display, 2-megapixel rear camera, 128 MB RAM and powered by a Samsung ARM microprocessor. It has the ability to get calls, send messages, surf internet, listen to music and many other important features. It came up with three important sensors: accelerometer and proximity sensor and ambient light sensor. People were very curious to experience this iPhone, and the sources say that there were stock shortages within an hour of availability. It supported only Edge cellular networks. iPhone 3G. This iPhone 3G was released on 2008 July as the successor of iPhone. This is the second generation of iPhones. It was released with two storage options, 8GB and 16GB with 128 MB RAM, and had two colors, black and white. It was not very different from the first iPhone, but there were some new features such as 3G connectivity and GPS option. This iPhone has 2MP rear camera, but it doesn't have the ability to zoom, no flash and to record videos, but with some various applications it could record videos. As it introduced with GPS, iPhone 3G had geotagging functionality. It had 3.5-inch TFT display with Corning Gorilla protection. With this iPhone, Apple introduced the App Store to download the applications for iPhone. iPhone 3GS. This is the successor of iPhone 3G, and it was released in 2009 June with two storage options, 16GB and 32GB, but later they discontinued those two versions and introduced 8GB version on 2010. This is the third generation of iPhones. This was powered by ARM Cortex-A8 processor. Here letter S stands for speed, as this iPhone is 2 times faster than the previous one. New camera was included in this new iPhone, a 3-megapixel camera with autofocus, auto macro and auto white balance, and had the ability to capture VGA videos. It has a 3.5-inch display with a pixel density of 163 pixels per inch. Other major introduction was voice control ability. With this feature, you can control your phone and music features with your voice. iPhone 4. iPhone 4, 4th gen iPhone, was released in June 2010 with some new exciting features. This iPhone came with 3 storage models, 8GB, 16GB and 32GB, with a 512 MB RAM with the colors of black and white. The camera of this phone has developed from the last iPhone, which include a 5-megapixel rear camera and a flashlight. This is the first iPhone to have a front-facing camera, which is a VGA camera. In this iPhone, they have used a new technology to their displays. They have used a Retina display, and it helped to increase its pixel density to 326, but they didn't change the ratio of the display. Still, it was a 3.5-inch display. And also, this was the first iPhone to use a micro SIM card slot. Previous versions used mini SIM cards. Also, they introduced gyroscope sensor for the iPhones from iPhone 4 onwards, which helps to measure the angular rotational velocity. iPhone 4S. iPhone 4S is the 5th generation iPhone, and it was released on the 4th of October 2011, which was the last presentation of the Apple company owner Steve Jobs. This is the first iPhone to available with 64GB storage, but still 16GB, 32GB versions remained. In this phone they have used a rear camera which can take 8-megapixel photos and record 1080p videos. The major introduction of this phone was the meaning of letter S. Letter S stood for Siri, which is the artificial intelligence personal assistant of the iPhones from iPhone 4s onwards. Siri can recognize our voice and answer our questions, and it can follow our voice commands. Still, they did not change the display size, came with 3.5-inch Retina display. And also, this iPhone was released with iOS 5, which included iMessages and iCloud. iPhone 5. iPhone 5 is the 6th generation iPhone, the successor of iPhone 4S, and this iPhone was released in September 2012. This was the first iPhone to change its display size after the first iPhone. This had a 4-inch display with nearly 16:9 aspect ratio. Also, this iPhone's memory had increased to 1GB RAM with 16, 32 and 64GB storages. Rear camera was a 8-megapixel camera, and front-facing camera had developed to a 1.2-megapixel camera. Other major change was the charging port. They introduced Lightning connector in this iPhone, replacing the 30-pin Apple dock connector. This was the first iPhone to have LTE connectivity. Previous versions only supported 3G connectivity. iPhone 5S and iPhone 5C. iPhone 5S and iPhone 5C are the successors of iPhone 5, 7th generation iPhones released in September 2013. First, take a look at iPhone 5S. iPhone 5S is physically equal to the iPhone 5 with minor changes, but there were major hardware changes in the iPhone 5S. iPhone 5S is the first iPhone to use Touch ID, a fingerprint sensor which used to unlock the phone and authenticate App Store and iTunes purchases. And this is the first iPhone to have slow-motion video recording ability with 720p quality and 120 frames per second. And for the first time Apple had used True Tone Flash in this phone, and this had the first 64-bit processor which was used in a smartphone. Let's take a look at iPhone 5C. This is the first time that Apple used letter C in their phone's name. C stands for the word color. Why they used this letter? iPhones were only released in black, white, gold colors until the release of this iPhone 5C. In this iPhone, they have introduced some different colors including blue, yellow, green and pink, and they didn't produce iPhone 5C with black color. This iPhone was released with 8GB, 16GB and 32GB models. Touch ID was not included in this iPhone. There were no major changes to the hardware comparing to iPhone 5. iPhone 6 and 6 Plus. These iPhones are the 8th generation of iPhones which were released on September 19, 2014. Both iPhones initially released as 16GB, 32GB and 128GB models, but in 2017 they released a 32GB version of iPhone 6 as a low-budget phone. In these iPhones they have decided to enlarge the sizes of the phones. iPhone 6 was released with a 4.7-inch display and iPhone 6 Plus was released with a 5.5-inch display. Both phones' rear camera had the ability to capture 30 and 60 fps Full HD videos and 120 and 240 fps 720p videos, while iPhone 5S had the ability to capture only 30 and 120 fps 720p quality videos. There were some hardware issues found in these iPhones such as bend gate issue, touch disease and hair ripping issues. But in the next generation they have fixed those issues and released new iPhones. But these two iPhones are the most sold iPhones ever. iPhone 6s and 6s Plus. iPhone 6s and 6s Plus are the 9th generation of iPhones. They were officially released in September 2015. iPhone 6s has the similar design to iPhone 6 and 6s Plus had 6 Plus design. These are the first iPhones to have 2GB RAM and first iPhone to include a 12-megapixel rear camera which had the ability to record videos in 4K at 30 fps. But still it can only record 6.5-megapixel videos. And also it had the live photo feature. They introduced pressure-sensitive touch technology called 3D Touch with this iPhones. These iPhones include 5-megapixel front-facing camera, which is a great improvement compared to previous iPhones. Initially these iPhones were released with 16GB, 64GB and 128GB models, but later they discontinued 16GB and 64GB and released a 32GB versions, and also this storages had used NVMe Express technology for the first time. iPhone SE. iPhone SE was released in March 2016 with two storage versions, 16GB and 64GB, but later they discontinued that versions and introduced 32GB and 128GB versions. This phone's design was similar to the iPhone 5S, and it had a 4-inch Retina display. Some features of iPhone 6s and 6s Plus also included in this iPhone. Especially the live photo feature, 12-megapixel rear camera with 4K recording ability. What is the meaning of SE? SE means the special edition. So they have released this iPhone because they wanted to release a more affordable iPhone and a smartphone small in size. This is the last iPhone with a 4-inch display. iPhone 7 and 7 Plus. iPhone 7 and 7 Plus were released in September 2017 as the 10th generation iPhones. Both iPhones were released with 32GB, 128 and 256GB versions. But iPhone 7 had a 2GB NVMe RAM while iPhone 7 Plus had a 3GB NVMe RAM, and that was the first iPhone to have a 3GB RAM. iPhone 7 had a 4.7-inch Retina display while 7 Plus had a 5.5-inch display. With this generation Apple introduced water and dust resistance ability to the iPhones. And also they had decided to exclude 3.5mm headphone jack from the iPhones after this generation. iPhone 7 came with a 12-megapixel rear camera and a 7-megapixel front camera. And iPhone 7 Plus came with a 12-megapixel dual camera setup, first iPhone to have a dual camera setup, and had a 7-megapixel front camera. Both had the ability to record 1080p videos with their front cameras, and the front cam had image stabilization feature. In this generation they have used a static home button. They introduced two new colors for this generation, jet black and matte black. iPhone 8 and 8 Plus. iPhone 8 and 8 Plus are the 11th generation iPhones which were released in September 2018. iPhone 8 basic appearance is similar to iPhone 7, while iPhone 8 Plus similar to iPhone 7 Plus. In this generation Apple has used a 11 Bionic hexa-core processor which is more faster than iPhone 7's A10 chip. Both models were released as 64GB, 128GB and 256GB versions. iPhone 8 had a 2GB RAM while 8 Plus had a 3GB RAM. As a new feature, Apple has introduced inductive charging in this generation. Still, they use 12-megapixel rear cameras and 7-megapixel cameras in this generation, while 8 Plus use a dual camera setup with a wide-angle lens and a telephoto lens. iPhone 10. iPhone 10 also 11th generation iPhone which was released in November 2018. This phone has a new design than the previous versions. They have introduced bezel-less design for the iPhone for the first time with this iPhone. And also the iconic home button was not included in this iPhone. Another biometric feature was included in this version, the Face ID feature. This can recognize the face of the user and unlock the phone. As the previous 11th generation phones, this also used a 11 Bionic hexa-core chip, and for the first time Apple used 5.85-inch Retina OLED display in this iPhone. This phone was released with 64GB and 256GB storages with a 3GB RAM. Rear camera had a 12-megapixel dual camera setup and a 7-megapixel front-facing camera. This iPhone has the QI wireless charging ability, and this iPhone had the shortest ever tenure as a flagship iPhone. iPhone XS and iPhone XS Max. iPhone XS and XS Max are the 12th generation iPhones which were released in September 2018. In this generation they have used a 12 Bionic 7nm chip, and iPhone XS and XS Max didn't have many differences internally, but the main difference was the display sizes. iPhone XS had a 5.8-inch OLED display and XS Max had a 6.5-inch OLED display. XS and XS Max were released as 64GB, 256 and 512GB models with a 4GB RAM for the first time in iPhone. Both phones have a 12-megapixel dual camera setup and 7-megapixel front-facing camera. These 12th generation phones are the first iPhones to record stereo audio for videos, and also for the first time they have used dual SIM setup in iPhones with a nano SIM and an embedded SIM which is a programmable SIM. iPhone XR. iPhone XR also a 12th generation iPhone which was announced in September 2018 but released in October 2018. This was the first iPhone after iPhone 5C to available in yellow and blue colors. This iPhone had 6.1-inch Retina display and came with three storage models: 64GB, 128GB and 256GB with a 3GB RAM. This iPhone had a 12-megapixel single rear camera and had the ability to record stereo audio in videos. It came with a 7-megapixel front-facing camera. And also it had the dual SIM setup with a nano SIM and eSIM. As the other 12th gen iPhones, it had the A12 Bionic 7nm chip. iPhone 11. iPhone 11 is a 13th generation iPhone which was launched in September 2019. iPhone 11 was released with three storage models: 64GB, 128GB and 256GB with a 4GB RAM. It was powered by Apple A13 Bionic chip. iPhone 11 is the first smartphone to have built-in ultra-wideband hardware. This also have the bezel-less design which was introduced with iPhone X. It came with a 12-megapixel dual rear camera setup and a 12-megapixel front-facing camera. Display was a 6.1-inch Retina display. They have not used their OLED display in this phone. It supports QI wireless charging and 18-watt fast charging. iPhone 11 Pro and iPhone 11 Pro Max. These are the 13th generation iPhones which were released along with iPhone 11. These phones were launched in September 2019. These two phones were released with three storage models: 64GB, 256GB and 512GB with a 4GB RAM. The major introduction in these phones was the camera setup. These two phones have a triple lens camera setup for the first time in iPhones. They have used them as wide, ultrawide and a telephoto lenses. They have the ability to record 4K videos up to 60 fps and 1080p slow motion at up to 240 fps. Front-facing camera was a 12-megapixel camera which had a true depth camera setup. These iPhones also powered by a 13 bionic chip. Main difference in these iPhones are the display size. iPhone 11 Pro has a 5.8-inch OLED display while iPhone 11 Pro Max has a 6.5-inch OLED display. iPhone SE 2020. iPhone SE 2020 is a part of iPhone 13th generation which was released in April 2020. This was the second generation of iPhone SE series. The physical appearance of this phone looks similar to iPhone 8 and had internal features of iPhone 11 series. This had a 4.7-inch Retina display and came with 64GB, 128GB and 256GB storages with a RAM of 3GB. This also had Apple A13 bionic chip. Rear camera was a 12-megapixel single-lens camera while front-facing camera was a 7-megapixel camera. iPhone 12 and iPhone 12 mini. iPhone 12 and 12 mini were the part of 14th generation iPhones which was released in October 2020. Both phones were released with three storage options: 64GB, 128GB and 256GB with a 4GB RAM. Major difference of these phones is the display. Both has the OLED Retina display. iPhone 12 has a 6.1-inch display and iPhone mini has a 5.4-inch display. Both had a dual-lens rear camera setup with wide and ultra-wide lenses. Front-facing camera was a 12-megapixel camera. These two iPhones were powered by new Apple A14 bionic chip. For the first time in this generation, Apple exclude charging adapter from PhoneBox, and also they introduced a magnetic charging connector called MagSafe. And also Apple introduced 5G support for the first time with this generation. iPhone 12 Pro and 12 Pro Max. These iPhones also a part of 14th generation iPhones. Both iPhones introduced with 128GB, 256GB and 512GB storage options with a 6GB RAM for the first time. Both had OLED Retina displays and iPhone 12 Pro had a 6.1-inch display and Pro Max had a 6.7-inch display. Both had a 12-megapixel triple camera setup including wide, ultra-wide and telephoto lenses. Front-facing camera was a 12-megapixel camera. As other phones of 14th generation, both support 5G connectivity and MagSafe charging. iPhone 13 and iPhone 13 mini. These iPhones are a part of 15th generation iPhones which was announced in September 2021. Both iPhones were released with three storage options: 128GB, 256GB and 512GB with a 6GB RAM. These iPhones were powered with new A15 bionic chip. Main difference among these phones is the display size. Both has a OLED Retina display and iPhone 13 has a 6.1-inch display while 13 mini has a 5.4-inch display. They have introduced a new diagonal 12-megapixel dual camera setup for this iPhone and has a 12-megapixel front-facing camera. iPhone 13 Pro and 13 Pro Max. These two also a part of 15th generation iPhones which was released in September 2021. These two iPhones were released with four storage options including 128GB, 256GB, 512GB and 1TB for the first time in iPhones. As the other 15th generation phones, this also powered with A15 bionic chip. And has a RAM of 8GB for the first time in an iPhone. Both has a 12-megapixel triple camera setup and 12-megapixel front-facing camera. iPhone 13 Pro has a 6.1-inch OLED display while iPhone 13 Pro Max has a 6.7-inch OLED display. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe the channel to join with us. Have a nice day.